Loving God, thank you for bringing us together today. We thank you for this time that we can spend in your presence, thinking about your word, listening to how your spirit might move among us, waiting for your guidance and where you'd like us to go with this conversation. We ask that you do lead the conversation, that we do listen for your word among us. And bless us all as we spend this time together in fellowship. And send your joy upon each of us this hour and the next. In your son's name, amen.
Amen.
Okay.
So a quick intro. I know Jenny talked about this, but one of the things I find so fascinating about Amy Jill Levine is that she, of course, is a Jewish scholar. And yet she's a New Testament scholar, which, as I think about, is just so fascinating to me, and yet it shouldn't be, because Jesus is a Jew. Jesus lived, Jesus taught, Jesus died as a Jew. And so I actually find it really imperative, at least for me, to hear a Jewish scholar's interpretation of what Jesus is saying. I just think that's really imperative that we hear it that way. And we're going to start with her video, because one of the things she talks about, these extensions she talks about as extensions of the law, additional things about the law, and she talks about them as fences. She talks about fence building around the law, and she gives a great description, because that still seems a little bit ambiguous to me. But the great description she gives is, think of a house, and you build a fence around it, and that fence protects a person from getting to the house. So in light of the law, building these fences creates a way for us to never even get close to the worst of it, if you will. If adultery is the worst of it, or let's think murder, if murder is the worst of it, but Jesus reconstructs that to be just harsh words. And if we think and try to live our lives outside that fence, we never get close to the worst of it. And she really wants us to think about things that way. But she also then switches this conversation to be something much bigger and much more about how we live in the community. So I would like us to listen to her first and hear her explanation of these fences and how she wants us to think about this in terms of our community and how we live our lives. So we're going to start with that. I'm going to screen share. Tell me if, send me a chat or something if you can't see this. We shouldn't have a problem, but let me see. That's not good. Interesting. Lynn doesn't have me as host, and so I can't screen share. This should be set up as a host, and I don't have host capabilities. All right. That's weird. So I can't share either the video. I'm going to text, give me 1 second. Let me text Lynn as we're talking, because maybe she can fix it while we're talking. But she doesn't have me set up as host.
She doesn't have you as co-host?
She doesn't have me as anything. She has me as a participant.
No.
And it should have been automatic. Hold on. We'll just continue, but I'll say, 1 second, sorry. I'm not set up as host. In the training class. Is there a way to fix it? Okay. Well, hopefully she gets to me. Okay, and hopefully we'll be able to see it, and we'll just watch it later. But so I'll go back to that. So she talks about this idea of building these fences around the law, so that we create a way to not get to the worst of it. And she talks about this. This used to be referred to, this section used to be called the antithesis, but she has a lot of problem with that word versus extensions, because antithesis means opposite. And she does not see these extensions as the opposite. She sees them as just an outgrowth of. So we're going to start, actually, we'll just start. I'm sorry you can't see it. Does anybody have a copy of this? I know a couple people printed it out. Can anybody help me do the reading at all? Okay. All right.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay. All right. So Karen, do you just want the very first thing that says read aloud? It's Matthew 17 through 20.
Sure.
Can you just start by reading that? That'll be our intro to this whole concept about the law. Okay.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
So that's the basics that Jesus is talking about with the law. He's really, really focused on it. And I would have really wanted the video here. Lynn's working on it, she says. But I want to go to the first extension, which is building, which AJ refers to as building a fence around murder. So I'll read that and we'll hear what we've heard the commandment being, and then what Jesus says about the commandment. And then we'll talk about that. So you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are together, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. All right, wait 1 second. Lynn says I've just become the host. Hold on. Ha, okay. We're gonna take a break right there. We'll take a break right there, and we'll watch Amy Jill, and we'll see what she has to say. All right.
Sound. I'm not hearing sound.
I'm
No
not.
sound. Yep.
No sound yet.
All right, let's see. Let me see if she gave me that. Hold on, let's see. Let me see, 1 sec.
Patty,
Yep.
before you go to the screen sharing, there should have been 2 little check boxes to share the
The
video.
the audio too, right?
Right. Video
All right, let's
and
try
audio.
it. I'm going to do the optimize. Let's do optimize. Try it again.
Okay.
All right, let's do optimize. Yes?
Sound. Yes.
Yes.
Great. Super.
The second major section of the Sermon on the Mount is usually called the Antithesis, a word that's difficult to pronounce and inaccurate when it comes to this section. Jesus is not giving antithetical, opposite interpretations of the law, but rather extending the interpretations. The Torah of Moses, the law given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, does not come with an instruction manual. So since the time of Moses, Jews have been working with each other to try to determine how best to live out and live in
to that law. When Jesus speaks about murder, about adultery, about oath-taking, he's not doing away with the Torah. To the contrary, he is extending the meaning. He's actually getting to the heart of the law and therefore making it, in fact, more rigorous rather than less. And in each case, he gets it right. In order fully to understand the New Testament, and especially fully to understand the Gospels, one needs to know the scriptures of Israel, what the church would call the Old Testament. But what happens if you come to the Sermon on the Mount and you don't know that earlier scripture? Jesus actually clues you in. You have heard it said, or it has been said to people of old, do this. That's a clue saying that's an earlier teaching. That's an earlier scripture. Go look it up. This is one of the reasons why people use annotated Bibles. This is one of the reasons why people use Bible studies like the one that you are using now, because all scripture is interpreted. You have heard it said, and the next question is, how do you understand it? And the answer Jesus will give will be how he understands that scripture. Jews typically debated the Torah. They debated how to follow the Sabbath. They debated, well, if you can't murder, what about manslaughter? What about somebody who breaks into your house at night? What happens if you accidentally injure someone? So the law is always debated and discussed, and it's always contextual, because a law that works in one setting may have to be massaged in another. But Jesus is not only doing what all Jews have done, which is to debate the law, but he's doing it in a very particular way. He says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Generally, people did not say, here's what I think. They would say, we might consider this, or I heard from my teacher that. Jesus is here very much speaking on his own authority, which is why at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds who are listening in at a distance marvel. He speaks with authority and not like the scribes. He's not going back to an earlier text. He's not going back to an earlier teaching. He's going back to Mount Sinai and saying, here's how I understand this text. That's what all good readers should do. So how best to interpret the Torah? You have a verse, and then you say, what are the parameters by which we can best live out this verse? Building a fence about the law is to protect the law. You have a law. What do? You make another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. What does it mean to build a fence about the law? The law says don't commit murder. Jesus builds a fence by saying, don't be angry with a brother or sister. And with that fence, you're less likely to commit murder. I think it would be helpful if we looked at all the 10 commandments, if we looked at all the various laws we have on the books of our state, our municipality, our nation, and say, how best do we live out this law? What fences do we build to make sure the law is being carried out in a just way, a fair way, a merciful way? That's where fence building comes in. One of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt, or you must not, commit adultery. At the time of Jesus, adultery was not defined the same way it is defined today. Today, it's defined by one spouse cheating against another, being unfaithful to another. At the time of Jesus, adultery meant a man having sexual relations with a woman who was married to somebody else or engaged to someone else. If a man chose to visit a prostitute, it didn't look nice, but that married man was not necessarily guilty of adultery. Indeed, at the time of Jesus, Jewish men could have more than one wife because Jewish society at the time was polygynous. King Herod the Great had at least 10 wives. So the law says, don't commit adultery. Jesus says, don't even think about it. That's building a fence about the law. The law here, in terms of do not commit adultery, is not related to the idea of stoning. And here's where that fence building comes in again. Although adultery, according to the scriptures of Israel, is a capital crime, adultery, according to the scriptures of Israel, is punished by being stoned. We never see anyone being stoned in all the scriptures of Israel, and we know people committed adultery, of which King David, along with Bathsheba, is our best example. People have heard the story in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, about the woman caught in the act of adultery. And she's dragged into the temple before Jesus where he is teaching. And the question is, what should be done to this woman? They're not attempting to stone her. My goodness, they're in the temple. That's not a place where you engage in capital punishment. Rather, they're raising a challenge to Jesus. If he says, don't stone her, they're going to say, well, we have the tradition of the elders that says, don't stone her, but by what authority do you say that? And if he says, oh, yes, stone her, they're going to say, that's unmerciful. How dare you? Which is why Jesus doesn't answer the question. He simply presents. He starts drawing on the ground. More ink has been spilled over what he wrote than what happened to the poor woman. And finally, he says, let the one among you without sin, let that person cast the first stone. And they all walk away. And for all my friends who are convinced that they drop their stones as they go, that's Hollywood. That's not the Gospel of John. People at the time, as far as we know, were not being stoned for adultery. In fact, the rabbis go out of their way to make capital punishment almost impossible. That in itself is building a fence about the law. I have heard far too often that Judaism, here connected with the Old Testament, is a system of retributive justice, an eye for an eye. And Jesus invents kindness and mercy and compassion. Turn the other cheek. That's an incorrect reading. Jesus does not have to invent kindness and mercy and compassion, because the God of Israel and the law of Israel and the tradition of Israel is all about kindness and mercy and compassion. And at the same time, you cannot have mercy without having justice, because justice without mercy is intolerable, but so is mercy without justice. Ancient Israel was not doing an eye for an eye, as far as I can tell. When Jesus speaks about an eye for an eye, he's actually changing the subject. He says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye. That means if somebody takes out your eye, perhaps you should take out someone else's. He says, instead, turn the other cheek. There is a world of difference between losing an eye or losing an arm or losing a leg and being slapped as a backhanded slap across the cheek. So here Jesus is using the scriptures of Israel as a platform to say, not in cases of actual physical violence where you lose a limb, but in cases of humiliation, degradation, being treated as less than human. How do you act? You don't act by revenge. You don't punch back. But neither do you lose your dignity. You stand up in the face of evil. You stand up in the face of injustice. And you say, I will not respond to violence with violence, but I will not take this by crouching, by kneeling, by losing my dignity. I will stand up straight and make you, the perpetrator, confront your violence. That's the model that the civil rights workers used when they sat in lunch counters. That's the model that people in India used under Gandhi when the British threatened them. That's the model that the Jews used when Caligula wanted to put his statue in the Jerusalem temple, and they engaged in a sit-down strike rather than going into revolt. And rather than saying, yeah, it's the Romans, they have the power. No. An eye for an eye should not be practiced, and Rabbinic Judaism never practices it. It says, in case of an actual loss of limb, monetary compensation. But at the same time, if there's injustice, stand up to it. Don't lose your dignity. That's what it means to turn the other cheek. Jesus speaks about oath-taking. Oath-taking is never really a good idea because you're promising over against the future. He says, don't take an oath. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And what do? We say, I swear to God. Or we go into a court and we put our hands on the Bible and we take an oath, the very text that says, don't swear an oath. The idea is you should always be honest. And don't promise God, if you let me do this, then I will do that. Because that's bargaining with God. And both you and God should be above that. You do what's right because it's right. And you don't bargain with God, because that would be putting God to the test. That's what Satan wants Jesus to do. Throw yourself off this cliff. because God's angels will raise you up. That's tempting God. That's bargaining with God. Why would you do that? God tells you what's needed. The prophets tell you what's needed. The Sermon on the Mount tells you what's needed. Just go do the right thing. It takes effort. It takes discernment. It takes some concentration, but there's no reason to bargain with God.
Wow.
Any initial reactions?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I do.
Oh,
Two things. One is the way I always have heard it, and I kind of believe it, is when Jesus says he came to fulfill the law and not erase it, what he was really talking about was that many Jews take it too literally. That it was more the spirit of the law that was most important. And so you go beyond the idea of an eye for an eye or, killing people. You should also show justice and show kindness to others. So he was kind of upset that they were taking it almost word for word, at least some parts of the Jewish community. And he wanted to explain to them that the spirit was most important. But she's kind of getting, this is my personal opinion. She's starting to get very defensive about defending the Jewish faith and the Torah, because there are all kinds of examples in the Old Testament where, Herod is looking for the baby Jesus to kill him. David and Goliath battle each other. There's all kinds of examples in the Old Testament where it does seem to operate as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And it's very warring kind of community. And even the different Jewish sects fight with each other very badly. So I think it's not till Jesus comes along, and you're quite right. He was born and died a Jew, but he gave them a different way of looking at things and saying to them, love your neighbor as yourself.
mm-hmm.
Put God first. I mean, he gave us rules to live by. He was Jewish, but I think he was trying to correct the real Orthodox Jews and the real conservative Jews, that there was a different way to read the Torah
Mm-hmm.
than they were traditionally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else? Mm-hmm. All right. So when I had heard that the first time, felt like I was being called to pretty much practice what she was talking about in terms of each of these commandments, which is what my handout is. We will look at each of these, or some of these, and we'll talk about them sort of in the spirit that she was talking about. And she asks after each one, I mean, this is pretty much an outline of her, what she would like us to think about. She asks after each one of these sections, how do we help build an ideal community based on how we see what we see as the fence around a particular commandment? So that's really where I'd like to go. I will walk us through a couple questions for each one of these, but I would like to get to that. How does this affect how we build an ideal community? And at the beginning, Karen and I were talking. She had done these videos right as COVID hit, so because she mentions it in there, so that they're very recent. And I think probably we all feel the same, which is this particular one may have something to do with with protesting that's going on, Black Lives Matter that's going on. So there's more going on with her in this, I think, than just her talking about the Sermon on the Mount. But I think that it's a way to open up the conversation so we can talk about how these different smaller fences affect how we build an ideal community. Is that okay? Are we willing to go there? Is that an okay conversation?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if I can just partially share my note so that everybody can participate. Let's see what happens. I don't want it to be full screen. Let me see if I can make it smaller. Do I have everybody? Can I see everybody? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it, but we only see a few of us.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I can't see you guys at all. Ugh. Okay.
Well, if you go up to the upper right-hand corner of your individual screens,
Yep.
There's a little box that says view.
You can do gallery view.
Yeah, you can do gallery,
right,
or speaker or full screen. Maybe that changes it.
No,
Yeah.
I'm gallery now, but when she puts on
Yeah.
something, it cuts down the number of people you see.
And so I'm on gallery view 2, which is what's getting me. And so I would hope that you could see the gallery view and that you can see my thing as well, but I'm losing my gallery view when I do it. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we can certainly just walk through the questions. Maybe I'll ask Lynn if there's something we're missing because I want to be able to do both. All right, if it's okay, we'll just continue. I don't want to spend any time on that. We talked about the issue of murder, and Jesus says it's just being angry. Just speaking angrily is paramount to murder. So this is one of these questions are pointed. These questions are difficult. These questions they're going to get us thinking about what we really think about how to build this community. If, in fact, those who commit murder or are excessively angry are also made in the image of God, what is our response to the law and capital punishment and how that affects our community? Do we have thoughts on that? If in fact that's the case, what is our response? If even being angry is akin to some type of murder, what do we do with that? These are really hard conversations. I just believe that she wants us to have them. She's asked the questions. Anybody? Bob?
Well, the old saying is, why do we kill people who kill people to prove that killing people is wrong? And I think Jesus says, if it's wrong for one, it's wrong for all. And that's why I have for long been opposed to capital punishment.
And I'll follow Bob by saying I'm also against capital punishment, basically because I think it puts man in God's position. I think God gives life and God gives life and he's the one who takes it away, not man. I don't think man has a right to take a life, no matter what somebody else does.
Yeah.
And
That's one of the things.
And I think of the commandment, thou shalt not kill.
Right.
So capital punishment is killing.
Right. It may be as simple as that, right? If we're going to follow the commandments. Yeah.
It seems to me that the response to that by a community that's loving and a Christian community should be to try to work with the people who are the offenders or prevent those offenses from occurring. So to create a society where they wouldn't have reason to be excessively angry or want to murder somebody. But that's pretty idealistic.
And I think the central message of Christianity is to forgive. I mean, forgiveness is a huge part of what Jesus has taught us. And so, I think in really some bad situations, we do have to learn to forgive, or life can't go on the way it's supposed to.
So what is, are there instances where, let's say, righteous anger, if anger is akin to murder, are there instances of righteous anger where we can behave that way? Does that help a community? Does it do anything for us?
Well, I think you have to remember too that, Jesus got angry a couple of times himself, and he threw the money changers, for example, out of the temple. I think you can have righteous anger and say somebody kills someone, or as the Germans did with the Jews in Germany, that they should be tried, and you've got to turn it over to, civil justice. And he does say, Jesus too, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and God's what's God's. So in some sense, justice as applied by courts and judges can very well execute laws that they feel, where we may interpret as righteous anger.
Anyone else on that one?
Well,
I think there is such a thing as righteous anger, because I see that as being a motivating factor to bring about justice. I think that what Jesus is pointing here with these fences is not to never get angry Okay. It's just if your anger gets out of control, this is where it will lead. Try to work out your differences with your adversaries before going to court, because if you don't, it could lead here. I think that that's kind of the bigger picture based on what she was saying in the video about the Sermon on the Mount. Try to stop it here before it gets to here.
Yeah, I love that, Annie. I agree. I think that's exactly the point. Because if we could, and Sharon had said something earlier too, that really struck me. Now I've just forgotten it. I'll remember it. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that if I know what it was, Sharon. You were saying that, if we create a situation where people don't have to respond that way, if we take it upon ourselves to, this is a horrible description, but when you're training a dog, they tell you, you don't leave the food on the counter so the dog might make the mistake. You create a situation where the dog can't make the mistake. And if we were to create a community where people aren't angry, where people don't feel they need to respond that way, that may be, yeah, I agree. I think that's what Jesus is getting at. Anybody else? We can move on to the next one. Okay. I guess I may be stuck reading them, but if everybody just closes their eyes and maybe they can be find a quiet space to listen, I'll read the next one. So this is about building a fence around adultery. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So one of her questions is that there's an historic double standard here. So in ancient Israel, sex between an engaged man and a woman who is not her husband or fiance is considered adultery, but a Jewish man can have sex with a divorcee, a prostitute, an unmarried or unengaged woman. So there's this double standard. So how does that relate to our relationships today? I don't know if we necessarily want to go into the gendered relationships today, but how does this relate to how does dealing with these double standards in these particular issues affect how we react to things? What do we do in those cases?
Try to fix them, eliminate them. I mean, you want a new community, you want the new kingdom on earth, you've got to really deal with that issue. And it takes time. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about race relations, you're talking about gender differences, age differences, to get people to see something totally different, it takes time and lots of effort.
Well, the first thing I thought of when she talked about that was men who refuse to have dinner alone with a woman in a professional setting because they might be tempted. And that is so unfair to women because men have the power role. And so, yeah, I don't know how you deal with that. Like, if you're going to put a fence around adultery and that's the fence, that is unjust.
That's really interesting. Any response to that? That's really interesting, Sharon.
I agree with her.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in business my whole life, and there's always been that double standard. And unfortunately, wives react to that too. If wives find out you're having dinner, it may be a business dinner, but she's really good looking. Some of them get uptight also. But that's why I said it takes time to people to educate and reorient. But she's absolutely correct. Women, we're not on equal footing in business because of those kinds of things.
Right. If we have to avoid these kinds of get-togethers or meetings because we're protecting ourselves, then we lose out, right? So yeah, and the issue of justice comes in there, doesn't it? Yeah.
But remember one thing though, Jimmy Carter made that line famous about lusting in your heart. And in a way he helped, but in another way he didn't help, because by pointing it out, most people do lust in their heart. So it made all of us instant sinners.
It did. Yeah, this is a very difficult one, right? I mean, because the fence is so far back, right? The fence is just even thinking it. And so, yeah, that calls into question our ability to be human, right? I mean, that's a really difficult one. One of the questions she asked is if the lines about it's better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. There's a lot of body talk here. There's a lot of like real harsh body talk. How does that make, what are your reactions about that? How does that make you feel about the human body and what its role is in this and how it comes into play in terms of adultery? Like he talks about the body and cutting off pieces if it does bad things. What's everybody's thought on that?
Extremely strong language. I'm not sure. To me, that's confusing. When you're starting to talk about, you're talking about relationships between people, or the way you're talking about just dealing with yourself, and you're talking about these things about losing body parts and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure why. Obviously, the speaker, Jesus or whoever came up with that, was wanting to make a strong point. But exactly how do you apply that they're saying? I think it brings up a huge amount of questions. Another question that I didn't bring up earlier that I have is, say, thou shalt not kill. Does that mean thou shalt not kill people? We're talking about fences. Or what about dogs or animals? We now have lots of rules about not killing or not treating animals inhumanely. And in a sense, that might be sort of a fence too, because you're controlling yourself as far as I mean, if you're mad at a dog, is that fine that you want to kill it? To me, that we're trying to develop a code of behavior that helps us to create a more compassionate, loving community, I think. And so that I would think it would mean, well, I mean, it's one thing if you're raising animals for food, that's one thing. But if you have relationships with animals, and my gosh, they get deeper and deeper all the time. We're doing surgeries on dogs. We're spending thousands and thousands of dollars on. I mean, we don't think of these as just food, and that brings it into another realm. Anyway, I opened up that a little bit, but we're talking about fences, and it seems like we're trying to come up with things that are not. I mean, this language of pluck your eye out is just pretty severe.
Well, and then this raises the question, if we wanted to go there, and we shouldn't, of Sharia law, right? I mean, this kind of thing is used in the name of religion today, which I think is where AJ wants us to go. This is relevant to today. This isn't an ancient conversation. This is still relevant, still important. And Tom, you bring up a great point. If we're talking about fences, I think the idea is to get us to think about these fences and what do these things really mean and how deep do they really go, right? Where is there a line that we draw, or do we keep going in order to build these ideal communities? Do we step back and go, yeah, do we kill animals? Do we step back and go, what about the environment? That kind of thing. I think this is where this is relevant, right? Does that make sense? Everybody?
Yeah, there's a great poem by D.H. Lawrence, and he's in Italy, and a poisonous snake is going to the well at the same time he is to get water. And he says, what's this snake doing here? It shouldn't be here. So he gets a stick and he gets the snake away so he can get the water and the snake can't. And then he has tremendous guilt about it. He reflects on it and says, what am I doing? The snake has as much right to that water as I do. And I think that's the other thing that's being said here, is that all creatures, not just man, should be respected, and we shouldn't be so quick to even hunt, let's say, for deer and stuff. People use the excuse, well, it's food and blah, 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 blah. But the bottom line is, as Tom is saying, it's not right to probably take any life, unless somehow you're threatened or somehow you need it for survival. But otherwise, I think we're supposed to respect all human life and build that fence further out and protect all creatures.
I agree.
Uh,
And I think that
Nick's point is well taken. However, I think we are not doing justice to this text because it's particularly a reference to interhuman relationships. There are probably other parts in the Bible which talk about the respect for God's creation and the earth and all that. However, this text really isn't about that.
what I was going to say, Bob, was what interested me there was but in light of the conversation building fences and really deeply thinking about these things, what I was interested in was how we got from, I just wrote that down, how we got from a conversation about adultery to human life, what we can take, etc. So I think that depth of conversation, you're right, we were off track, but I thought it was interesting how we got from one to the other. So it's just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the connection is judgment. The connection is we can judge other people like when they're doing adultery or divorce. But we're also judging when we decide to take another life, if it's an animal, let's say. So all these things are related in terms of you personally making judgments about things and making a decision about how life should really be lived. Right? I thought that's where you were trying to build, and she is, towards this idea of a new community. And in a way, we're trying to build towards a new kingdom in religious terms. Right? Where the lion lays down with the lamb and war goes away and all those good things. So if we're going to get to that point at some place, we got to think about individual judgment and how we make those judgments. I think that's the connecting link.
All right, in the interest of time, we'll move on. So this is building a fence around divorce. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So the words around the grounds for divorce are vague in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this has led to both narrow and broad interpretations. So what do you think our church's view is, should be, etc., on these and other kinds of relationships like this? Do we have thoughts on this?
We talk about gender imbalance. So, one thing we should say too, there are women who divorce men, correct? So then that whole issue arises again. Well, what's the proper role for a woman? And in both in Judaism and in Catholicism, it's very hard to get a divorce. I mean, if you're going to play by getting a divorce through the church or the synagogue, the process is a very long, detailed process. And it's not granted that easily. In the Catholic Church, you got to go before a tribunal. I don't know exactly what you have to do in Jewish faith, but I've known Jews who've gotten divorced who described it again as a process that you got to go through to show that either the marriage wasn't really complete or somebody cheated on somebody or whatever the deal was. Civil, divorces are easier, but not religious divorces in the Catholic Church or the Jewish religion. I don't know what it's like in Presbyterians.
What do we think the role of the church is in supporting those who do get divorced? Does the church have a role in that?
Well, I think that there maybe here again there's a bigger picture, because you guys were talking about the economic imbalance, and I think that in ancient times that if a husband could just declare divorce, walk away, and not take any responsibility. And I think that it's a little bit of a different situation today, but in some ways it's still the same. It's maybe not so much the issue of the divorce, the ending of the marriage, but walking away from your responsibilities. Do you no longer pay attention to the children that you have together? Do you no longer pay child support? Are those the moral issues that we're getting at here with this? you just wash your hands of it and move to the other side of the country and forget about it and start a new life because that's convenient for you. I think that Jesus would be opposed to that more so than the actual act of a divorce, where you still have a relationship with your ex that's supportive. And it's difficult to be healthy, but you have a partnership in raising your children, and making sure that each party leaves in a way that they can take care of themselves in the future, that they're not left destitute. That's kind of my interpretation of that.
So there are actually many more fences around this concept of divorce. That while it may occur, makes it acceptable and just, etc. Yeah, is that what you? Anybody else in this one? So let's talk about violence. All right. You've heard that it was said eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. This is the one that Amy was talking about. If anyone slaps you right on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So we go really far from turning the other cheek to don't turn away from one who wants to borrow from you. So this scripture is clearly designed to limit vengeful violence, and almost all rabbinic text does. So what do we think about her concept that he has literally turned the conversation from violence, from eye for eye, to this turning the cheek, and just completely gone in the other direction to talk about how we really are supposed to respond to the other? The stranger, the ones we don't understand, the ones we don't want to get in the room with.
Well, it's a powerful vision of when you're being attacked with violence, to turn the other cheek. And if you think about Martin Luther King, or you think about Gandhi, they showed how powerful nonviolence can be. It can move worlds and change governments and all kinds of good stuff. It's a hard thing for human beings to do. But again, Jesus is constantly trying to get us to think about getting to an ideal, or getting to a utopia almost. And, it's made us better by trying to do that, but it's difficult.
Is there ever a time when violence is the answer? I try to think. I can't. Does anybody know of a time? Can anybody think of a time? Is there an instance in your life where violence is the answer? That seems so obvious, but this is obviously deeper than that.
Well, I think in genocide studies, they said that actually if there's strong international institutions that will respond when there is a genocide, and oftentimes they break down, for example, in Rwanda, if we had followed the treaties that we had signed and agreed to, we should have intervened there. And if dictators around the world know that the powerful countries in the world are going to say something to them when they are going to intervene, they're going to think twice. That's kind of what genocide studies professors get into, and people like Samantha Power. That's where a lot of their studies have gone.
What do you think about, I think everybody here knows what we're talking about. What do you think about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa? That was an instance where they just simply didn't go there, and everybody was seen as a victim. Every survivor was seen as a survivor, and they took a completely different approach to this. Does anybody have thoughts on that? Because there was so much violence and so much death. And does anybody have thoughts on that? That's a really good one.
I'm not specifically answering your question, but I'm a political scientist by training. So, we've learned that balance of power is a good concept because it usually prevents violence. That if one side's threatening and the other side can match the threat, that sometimes people decide it's not worth getting into a violent situation. So it's not exactly Christian. It's not exactly, I think, what Jesus would advocate, but it's damn powerful and works. I mean, the fact that you have people who have nuclear weapons and no one's dared to use it is because everybody's afraid of what retaliation might look like. So, you know, we're not always such good Christians, so we find other ways sometimes to get to a good point. At least we're not bombing each other every day, but it's not perfect. You know, we're not getting exactly where Jesus wants us to go, but it is effective.
What does it mean in our local community? What does it mean in our church? How do we behave in our church, in our local community? How do we build that ideal community around this idea of complete nonviolence? I mean, does it go so far as to extend the hand? Is it not just toleration, but does it mean you go so far as to extend the hand?
It does. And you know, from Jesus's point of view, it certainly is. You go beyond it and you do more than just balance the power. You basically say, what's your problems? Let us help you. If it's economic, we'll give you money. If it's food, we'll give you food. And, you know, United States has done a lot. You can name the alliances, name different things we've done to try to avoid wars by helping countries that are in bad positions. I mean, we've had a tradition of trying to help. So we avoid violence. Not always perfect, not always balanced, but we've tried.
What about bringing back 101? You know, it's great to give it to the government.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
No, you can't hear me?
A little bit. Ah, shoot.
Yeah, go ahead.
Try
Try.
Better?
a little bit.
A little bit. Let me get my headset.
Oh, that's better.
I'll come back to it.
Okay, get your headset. So while we're waiting for Anne, because we're going to run out of time, you know, Jesus says that, for I tell you that your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So what is our definition of righteousness here? What, unless our righteousness surpasses the definition that the Pharisees, what is our definition of righteousness? And how are these extensions, these ideas of these fences and how far back we're pushing them relate to this idea of righteousness? What how do we define our righteousness? Oh, Anne's back.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yep, gotcha.
Okay, good. My PC is old and the speaker and audio is both going. I mean, speaker and mic is going. What I was thinking about, all these great systems, you know, I keep flipping back to your handout. And I think it's great to talk about in terms of systems, but the reason I come to Journey class is how I can apply it in my life as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's about, particularly on as an example on the violence piece, to combat violence, there's only so much I can do. And about the best thing I can do, because I hate fighting, is to seek where the other person is coming from. I go to St. Francis, seek to understand. Because I think violence, we get, whether it's killing somebody or, you know, being violent, it's because we're so angry, we want to go and retaliate as opposed to forgive. And if we can come from a place of seeking to understand, then we're extending an olive branch.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what a lot of this, I'd like to think, well, this is what the scripture is saying to me anyway. That's what I'm getting from it.
I think that idea of giving a handout is looking at the problem that's causing the other party to be violent and think, well, if we remove the problem that they're struggling with, then the cause for violence may disappear.
Nancy,
And
did you want to
it
say
may
something?
not, but it might.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
No,
And that all comes back to justice. You know, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, whatever.
Right.
You
have to watch
get a
out
just
for
society.
you have to watch out for balance as well, and boundaries, because you don't just want to fall over and give all and have people take advantage of you as well, because that's not teaching them to be kind and forgiving, and you know, it teaches them to want to take advantage. So there has to be a balance met, I think, in giving and and how to give.
And that's what Amy was saying at the beginning of her piece, that that you don't just bow down, you don't kneel, you don't give in, you just don't use violence.
Right. Right. Yeah, she had no time to advocate. It's just, oh, well, it's the Romans, so we might as well just let it go. She didn't know, but there's a way to be in the world. It's about, right. It's exactly that, and it's applying these fences to ourselves, right? And it's how we use them in the world. We can't fix everything, but it's how we personally apply them, right?
I think in a violent situation where things are getting rather inflamed and intense, if you can come up with something that will smooth the waters. And I think that really, if you're looking at the opposing party, your opponent, and you see what's really getting, so maybe the reason behind the violent behavior, and you do sort of a loving gesture to try to solve that problem that's affecting that other person, that might just smooth out the whole thing, and the violent inclination will disappear.
One of the things that AJ said that I liked so much I wrote down was stand up to injustice with dignity. And that's a takeaway that I hadn't really thought about before. I'm a huge fan of Brian Stevenson, his Equal Justice Initiative. And that's what he does every day. He stands up to injustice, but with dignity, not afraid to back down, not in a mean-spirited way at all, but in a loving way.
Right.
Which is hard for a lot of us to pull off.
I mean, if you've got an interaction with someone who really is a bully, and if you turn the other cheek, that is just a sign of weakness and can escalate a bad situation. So I think when you do it with dignity, though, that's confronting them at the same time. I mean, I've tried just turning the other cheek, and I've thought that didn't work. It was one lesson I only had to try once.
There's a lot of different circumstances, that's for sure. And to pick and choose is very difficult situation sometimes to understand and know.
A lot of times, one of the keys is, and Anne kind of alluded to it earlier, is to seek to understand the differences and to dialogue those differences out. And many times that will disarm an angry person, because all of a sudden you're giving credence to their anger in that you are willing to listen to them. You're not necessarily agreeing with them, but you're willing to hear them and you care about them. And many times that's the source of anger, that the person feels neglected or unheard or unwanted. And if we in the church can do that, that's a huge witness for Christ.
That's a great skill to know.
Great, yeah.
I'm
I always like that saying, don't judge another person till you walk a mile in their moccasins.
Right.
That if you really aren't being sympathetic, you're being empathetic. And you're really trying to understand where they're coming from and what's happening. And this is what Anne was saying too, about seeking to understand. It very often disarms the other person because they see you really do have some concern for them. And you're trying to understand what pain they're going through and how you can help them with that pain. That's very Christian. But that expression of seeking to understand is really important.
I'm super mindful of the time, just so everybody knows. So if we need to go, we need to go. But Jean, go ahead. I mean, just so you know, I know what time it is. Go ahead.
I was just going to say active listening.
Yes.
What we're all talking about is active listening.
Active and reflective listening.
Yeah. Well, I am mindful of the time. Bob, back to your point, I'm really amazed at where, not really because of this group, but where this conversation has gone when we're looking at let's just talk about the commandments. And then you take it just one step further and you actually start to think about what else it might mean and how else it might affect how you go out into the world. It becomes a much deeper conversation. Nobody here is going to murder anybody, but what does that really mean? And how do you apply it in your life? And, nobody's going to commit adultery. But what does that really mean? And how does it apply? And the way the conversation went is quite amazing to me. And I would hope that we could take this further and that we can think about the kinds of things that we hear Jesus say, we hear other people say Jesus says, and what it might really mean for us and our application and way to be in the world. Does anybody have any other comments or closing comments? No. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I'll close in prayer. Ann, go ahead. What are you going to do? Oh, okay. And does anybody else want to close in prayer? I'm happy to. Okay. Okay. Holy Spirit, thank you so much for bringing us together. Thank you for guiding us through these very difficult conversations, but very enriching conversations. Let us go into the world mindful that you may mean far more than it appears you do at first glance. May we strive to actively listen to the other, to commit no violence beyond any fences, to reach out to the stranger, to the other, and to follow your deeply ethical guidelines for the way we are to be in the world. Thank you again for this conversation, for the Spirit moving among us. Amen.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you,
Thanks,
Patty.
Thank you.
Good job, Pat.
Thanks.
Good job, Patty. All right.
Great,
Thank you.
thanks. See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.